That was good. Thank you. Today's sermon title comes out of the middle of this long section that I've chosen for the sermon today. Jesus is on trial before Pilate. Now, there are many fruitful and maybe just plain interesting conversations we could have out of this passage. For instance, think about the fact that the name Bar-Abbas, Bar-Abba, son of the Father, is who is released at the trial. It's fascinating what John is pointing out to us there by including that detail. We could explore Pilate. If you'd love to know more about Pilate's history and the myths and legend that grow up around Pilate, N.T. Wright says he may have been Scottish. I think N.T. Wright might be having a bit of a prejudiced view there. He's Scottish. But there's all kinds of history, and we could explore that, and it might inform us a little bit about who Pilate is and why John takes so much time. He tells more about Jesus' trial with Pilate than all three of the other Gospels combined. We could explore what's going on with the Jewish authorities and how they exist and how they're structured, and why is it that they have such animosity towards Jesus and are so eager to have him executed. And why do they do all the crazy things they do? They're worried about going into Pilate's palace because they'll be defiled and can't eat Passover. But the truth is they could simply take a bath when they get home and still eat Passover. So why are they making a big deal about it? A lot of speculation. We could explore a lot of ideas, and we could look in a number of things. But let's be real. You don't want a 3-hour sermon. And Jesus is the main character of the story.
That's right.
And so I want to focus on what's happening with Jesus. Ultimately, this story focused down for me as we wrestled through this text last Monday into this idea, this statement that Jesus makes. It's his final statement of why he came into the world. Now, 6 times in the Gospel of John, Jesus makes a statement of purpose of why he came into the world. He says, I have come 6 different times in 6 different places, and makes a statement of purpose. I have come, and this is why. Now, more than that, he says, I've come, but 6 times he says why. And at the end of chapter 9, after Jesus has healed the blind man, remember that great chapter, the story about the blind man and all the arguments with the Pharisees and all that went on with that. At the end of that story, when Jesus has introduced himself to the blind man, and he asks him if he believes, and the blind man says, well, who is this, Lord, that I could believe? And Jesus says, you're looking at him. And the blind man says, I believe. And then Jesus says to the people gathered there, among which are Pharisees, I came into the world for judgment, so that those who do not see may gain their sight, and the ones who see may become blind. Now, what I want you to notice there is this judgment that Jesus came into the world for first brings sight to the blind. That's what the judgment does. In chapter 10, as he describes the sheep who hear and follow his voice, he says, I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. These sheep that hear Jesus and know his voice, Jesus came to bring them life. In chapter 12, Jesus makes a notable turn in these purpose statements. He announces that the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. But for Jesus in this passage, glorification immediately is talk about a seed falling into the ground and dying. And he invites his disciples to go where he's going, which is to the cross. He says the Son of Man is going to be lifted up. And he says now the judgment of the world, now the ruler of this world will be thrown out. And so again, this judgment theme and his glorification by dying. And then a little later in chapter 12 at verse 46, Jesus goes on to say, he came into this world to be a light in this dark world. And at verse 47, again, he says, clarifying the judgment theme, he did not come to judge the world. He came to save the world. And remember that we have already discussed and learned this phrase, the world, for John means those who have rejected Jesus. He came to his own, chapter 1 told us, and his own did not receive him. Came to be the light, but they hated the light. And yet these are the ones Jesus came to give sight to and life to. Bring into relationship with God. In our text today, Jesus gives this sixth and final reason that he came. Pilate said, "So you are a king?" And Jesus said, "You say that I'm a king. That's your way of talking about this. For this reason I was born. For this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth," catch it? "listens to my voice." To testify to the truth. This phrase seems less straightforward. We need some context to understand. What do the people who belong to the truth listen to? They listen to Jesus' voice. But what is Jesus testifying to? What is he saying in this scene, in this episode, in this time of moving from Caiaphas to Pilate, and from Pilate to the cross? What does Jesus testify to? I want you to pay attention and answer two questions for me. I'm looking for audience participation when we finish reading. First, who possesses power in this story, and what power do they possess? Who possesses what power? Certainly Jesus has some power, but Pilate has power too. He makes a bold statement about it, and these Jewish authorities have power. Who has power, and what power do they have? I want you to pay attention as we read this story. And then the second question, Jesus says some things. He does some things. He remains silent and still. Why? What is John telling us? In Jesus' words and deeds, in even his silence, what is Jesus telling us? What is he testifying to? I want you to pay attention and think about that. Okay, you ready? Let's read the text. At least Rachel's ready. She nodded her head. She did. They brought Jesus from Caiaphas to the Roman governor's residence. Now it was very early in the morning. They did not go into the governor's residence so they would not be ceremonially defiled, but could eat the Passover meal. So Pilate came outside to them and said, "Okay, what accusation do you bring against this man?" They replied, "If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate told them, "Take him yourselves. Judge him according to your own law." The Jewish leaders replied, "We cannot legally put anyone to death." Oh. This happened to fulfill the word Jesus had spoken back in chapter 12, when he indicated what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate went back into the governor's residence, summoned Jesus, and asked him, Are you the King of the Jews? Jesus replied, are you saying this on your own, or has someone told you? Pilate answered, I'm not a Jew. Am I? Your own people, your chief priests, handed you over to me. What have you done? Jesus replied, my kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my servants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish authorities. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Then Pilate said, so you are a king? Jesus replied, you say that I'm a king. For this reason I was born. For this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. Pilate asked, what is truth? When he had said this, he went back outside to the Jewish leaders and announced, I find no basis for accusation against him. But it is your custom that I release one prisoner for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? They shouted back, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a revolutionary. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged severely. The soldiers braided a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they clothed him in a purple robe. They came up to him again and again and said, Hail, King! King of the Jews. And they struck him repeatedly in the face. And then Pilate went out and said to the Jewish leaders, look, I'm bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no reason for accusation against him. So Jesus came outside, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, look, here is the man. When the chief priests and their officers saw him, they shouted out, crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate said, you take him and crucify him. Certainly, I find no reason for accusation against him. The Jewish leaders replied, we have a law. And according to our law, he ought to die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. When Pilate heard Son of God, he was more afraid than ever. And he went back into the governor's residence and said to Jesus, where do you come from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said, do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know I have authority to release you and to crucify you? Jesus replied, you would have no authority over me at all unless it was given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin. From this point on, Pilate tried to release him. But the Jewish leaders shouted out, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Then Pilate heard these words. He brought Jesus outside, sat down on the judgment seat, full authority, in the place called the stone pavement, Gabbatha in Aramaic. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, about noon. Pilate said to the Jewish leaders, look, here is your king. And then they shouted, away with him, away with him. Crucify him. Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? They replied, "We have no king but Caesar." Look at that last line. Remember when Samuel came to God saying Israel's demanding a king? They want a king. Remember what God said to Samuel? Don't let it upset you, Samuel. They haven't rejected you as prophet. They've rejected me as king. Look at the whole verse. Shall I crucify your king? We have no king except Caesar. What has this one episode been about? What is this story about? Anyone?
Rejecting God.
It's about rejecting God. It's about rejecting a king. It's about rejecting Messiah. It's about who is king? Who's in charge? Are the chief priests in charge? Is Pilate in charge? Is Jesus in charge? Is God in charge? Are the chief priests trying to do for God what God can't do for himself? Reject a false Messiah? Eliminate a false Messiah? Is Pilate serving the true God? Caesar? Tiberius? Who's on vacation? What is this about? This is about power and control over a nation of people. This is a struggle, and it's all coming to a head right here in this moment. For Jesus, it's about much more than that. For everybody else in the room, in the place, it's all about who's got the power and who's going to get their way, who's going to get the win in this struggle. Who had the power in this story? What power did Pilate have? He says, come on, what power does Pilate have?
Release or crucify.
He can release Jesus or he can crucify Jesus. In fact, if Pilate wants to call down the Praetorian Guard, not the Praetorian Guard, if he wants to call down the temple guard out of the Antonia fortress and kill all the chief priests, he's got that power, doesn't he? Yes?
Yes.
The problem is, Pilate's already had 2 big massacres on his watch, and both of them turned out really badly. He's already faced 2 major rebellions. Once, when he brought in banners that had the picture of Tiberius on them and stood them up in the temple, and the Jewish people came out in riot. And he had to put the riot down, and it went very badly, and he had to pull the banners out of the temple grounds. The second time, he is he's up in Caesarea, and he's dealing with some people who are angry over this building project. He's going to finish an aqueduct, and to pay for the aqueduct, he decided to get money, treasures out of the temple, and use the money out of the temple and the treasures out of the temple to pay for the building of the aqueduct. And these Jews didn't like it, so they show up at his hippodrome during the festivities, and they stand in the middle, and they are in riot and rebellion over him robbing the temple. And he says, if you don't get out of here, I'm going to kill you. And they bare their necks and say, slit our throats right here. We would rather die than have you desecrate our temple. Pilate has to back off. He knows this is going to end up in great turmoil and great trouble. And what happens to a governor whose region is in riot? He gets replaced by a new governor, and the ending is not good for the governor. And so Pilate faces, on this Passover day, he's in Jerusalem to make sure that such a riot is not going to happen. He's brought reinforcements from Caesarea, and he's there to keep the peace during the Passover. He doesn't want these foolish religious Jewish people uprising and causing a problem, and now he's face to face with these chief priests. And he has the power to wipe them all out. Or does he? Or does he? And these chief priests, what power do they have? I mean, they're the oppressed people. They're the subjects, right? What do? How do they exert their power? I'm asking. Anybody? We just read it. They claim to be loyal subjects to Rome. What else?
Quote their law.
They quote their law. They also say, we have a law by which he should die, but we're not allowed to kill him. So they put the onus on Pilate. They put him in his place, his rightful place of authority. But the big one is that they manipulate him by threatening him with accusations of rebellion against Caesar. Yes?
Yeah.
They threaten his life. How about Caesar finds out what you've done? How about Caesar finds out? Such power. They control the situation, and ultimately they get Pilate to do what they want him to do, wielding their power. But what power does Jesus have? He's got all the power.
God-given power.
He's got God-given power. He has divine power. But before you go singing, he could have called 10,000 angels. I want you to think for a minute about how Jesus exercises power. What does Jesus testify to? In words, what does Jesus say? What does he say about his kingdom?
Not of this world.
It's not from here. My kingdom is from somewhere else. And that's why I look like a different kind of king. And that's why my followers are not fighting to establish my kingdom. Testifies to the truth. He testifies that Pilate's authority is real, but from God. Yes? He testifies. How about in action, in deeds? How does Jesus testify? That's a trick question. Jesus doesn't do anything except submit to their authority. Now, at this point in the sermon, you should start getting really uncomfortable. Because it's at this point that all of us Christians, all of us Christ followers, all of us Christ imitators, we're not so keen on imitating Jesus at this point. Jesus' deeds testify by his submission to the mission of God. And what about his silence? His silence and his submission testify to the fact that Jesus will not exert his power the way the world exerts its power. His kingdom is not from this world. He will not exert power as Pilate does. He will not exert power as the chief priests do. Jesus is exerting his power, and in fact, Jesus is causing the outcome to be exactly what God wants the outcome to be. And he's doing it by full submission and silence in the face of accusation. Jesus testifies that God does not use power as the world does. He cannot, in fact, he condemns the world's power and denounces it by showing what it truly stands for: intimidation, oppression, and ultimately violence. John shows us that Pilate tries hard to rise above this power system and to release Jesus. But ultimately he cannot. because he knows that all of the violence he has inflicted in his life is about to come down on him. Even as Jesus suffers, his blood testifies that people who intimidate, overpower, and injure others have rejected light and favored the darkness. Can I do that one again? This is like, I spent a lot of time on that line. I want to do it one more time. Even as Jesus suffers, his blood testifies that people who intimidate, overpower, and injure have rejected the light in favor of the darkness. But what does this have to do with a bunch of nice people like us sitting in Parker County? I believe Jesus is calling us to make God's mission greater than maintaining the status quo. And I'm not just talking about the church, I'm talking about life in general. Jesus has called us to make accomplishing God's mission even at the risk of our personal safety. Even in the sacrifice of our constitutional rights. Even in what makes sense to the world in exercise of power. To make the mission of God, will what I'm about to say or do accomplish God's mission in the world? That has to become greater than maintaining the status quo. If we believe our mission is to maintain tradition or culture, we will miss the Messiah. If we join God's ministry of reconciliation, we will understand that nostalgia works against us. I believe that this story teaches us that we are called to woo rather than ravage. For those who were in the Wednesday night class, this is review. We read letter 8 from the Screwtape letters, and one of the things that Screwtape tells his understudy demon is that the strange thing about God is, unlike the demons, God will only woo the humans. He will invite them. He will draw them gently, but he'll never ravage them. He'll never overpower them. He'll never dominate them as the demons want to do. Our job is to influence rather than to coerce. Our testimony in word and deed has to demonstrate the promise of the beauty of God's reign in people's lives. And then we let other people choose. And I believe this passage teaches us to prepare. To prepare ourselves. Can you go back a slide? Not quite there yet. There we go. No, one more. There we go. To prepare to be misunderstood and persecuted. Jesus told us in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Paul carries the message as well, and so does Peter. The pure persecution is surely coming. Peter tells us to arm ourselves and be ready for persecution. Please understand, we're not just talking about, although we are talking about, those Christians who are being killed and having their churches burned in places all over the world simply because they are Christian. But we have to understand that people who benefit from being in positions of power never relinquish power happily. And they are not happy when anyone, Christian or not, calls them out for their misuse of power. If we stand for the mission of God and we call for the dignity of people, our neighbors, we are called to love, we can expect to be persecuted. God's way is clear. Jesus disarms the rulers and authorities, but he does it by his own death. And then at Pentecost, the same mob that yelled out, crucify him, cries out to the apostles, what then shall we do to be saved? Peter offers them rebirth, new life in Jesus Christ. Today I want you to help me close. So I'm going to ask you to stand. And if you're comfortable, I invite you, because I will woo and not ravage, to read this prayer with me out loud. It is St. Francis's peace prayer. We're going to read it slowly. O Divine Master, grant that we may seek not so much to be consoled as to console. Sorry, hold on. Were there 3 slides? Because this is the second half. Let's start there and hope that it goes to the second one. Forgive me, I realized after we got into it, I was in the wrong place. Start over. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, help us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, grant that we may seek not so much to be consoled as to console, to be loved as, let's start over. To be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Praise to you.